Hello my brothers and sisters of the Order, welcome back to the Order. I'm Celtic Templar, and today y'all, for this what if video, we're actually going to be talking about what if gunpowder never existed. Now, up to y'all's major vote, y'all chose what if gunpowder never existed. And now, this one actually I've had looked online a lot more than once. And majority of the people today think that Templar firearms are evil, and in such, gunpowder should never have existed. There's a utopia. Yeah, keep thinking that, because it's not true. In fact, in our alternate timeline, gunpowder, if it never existed, it might be a lot worse and a lot more horrifying for a long time. So at this point, we have to look back in history. Gunpowder first was created in the 9th century CE, or 9th century AD, in China. And such, Chinese culture actually invented the gunpowder pretty much as a long-lasting elixir. Little did they know that they created gunpowder. Upon creating gunpowder, they ended up, well, firstly did not actually have it as an explosive weapon like modern firearms do. In fact, it was more of like a flamethrower, really. In fact, the best way I can explain it is like, for example, you taking a sparkler. That's the best way it can actually be viewed. So, what is the major thing about gunpowder at this point? Why did it evolve in its entire form? Well, simple. It evolved mainly because over the centuries, it actually started to determine on how warfare was created. And the fact is, because of the Mongols, we later actually got it into the said European culture. Probably around the 1400s. So, why is it that people don't understand this point? Simple. Early firearms never existed in Europe until the 15th century. The 15th century started to give way to a lot more type of firearms. Such firearms are like this, a flintlock design system, which it fires off the design of fire. However, many people would automatically think, Templar, these are older guns. What does this have to prove? Simple. Everything. In fact, when we take a look at earlier firearms like this gives us a good example on what firearms evolved from. Pretty much from this pistol to something like this. So yeah, I want to put this out here. When it comes down to it, firearms would evolve no matter what. The fact is, we evolved from the old flintlock to a modern day cartridge system. And in fact, people automatically think that firearms always look like this. No. Firearms always looked like this for a long time period. In fact, the flintlock and wheel-lock mechanism stayed on their guns until sometime around the 1800s, when they started to evolve to percussion cap systems. Then they actually designed breech-loading systems by the late 1800s. Because of modern technology. So the fact is, the gun kind of skyrocketed us into warfare. The end of which is what we get today. But now many people ask, but Templar, what would warfare look like and what would the world look like if gunpowder never existed? Let's put ourselves in an alternate 9th century CE. In doing so, China never invents gunpowder. It is lost just like Greek fire. It is impossible to remake. In doing so, the entire form of warfare and as such could end up changing. One major way you can actually understand this, though, is that I could still see warfare somehow evolving into the ways it does. For example, let's take a look at European warfare, mainly during the time of the 15th to the 16th century. This type of warfare was actually known as pike and shot formation, which was also used during the English Civil War. Now in such, people automatically would think that everyone would always wear plate armor. Not exactly true, seeing to the fact that plate armor started to devolve into just being helmets. Not because gunfire can easily go through plate armor. In fact, by the time of the English Civil War, plate armor had evolved in such a way that it actually became bulletproof. So why is it that, well, firearms were not the reason behind all of the said plate armor? Well, that's simple. Plate armor devolved because one major reason. It was costly. In fact, trying to pay for a certain set of armor would take months to create, of which you probably wouldn't have the rest of your life to do so. As well, the majority of times you don't actually have the money to pay for it. In fact, paying for plate armor was pretty much impossible. So you would actually, well, have your grandfather's hand-me-downs. And the fact is, you even had to have it shaped to your body. In fact, my grandfather is nowhere near the same size as my father was, and nor was I am the same type of shape and build as my father. So in fact, this is why many times over, armor would actually change for the difference in time periods. Now, it's probably true that we would still probably wear male undergarments like gambesons and such, but I doubt that they would be impossible to destroy. But one major thing is, the gun was not the reason armor died off, nor was it the reason the knight died off. Knights died off because of political reasons, and as well, the said armor died off because of cost. However, to this major form, I do have to explain, is that why does this need to be explained? Simple. Warfare itself changed. And the fact is, if we take a look at our pike and shot formation, I could probably see us seeing, well, instead of pike and shot, we hear of pike and volley, meaning of pikes and archer volleys, mainly from crossbows or bows and arrows. English military would probably end up using, well, the longbow, while continental Europe still used, well, the crossbow. To this major form, though, would warfare entirely change? Slightly yes and no. But to the major form, warfare itself would evolve, and in such, plate armor would still be used. However, probably to only those who could afford it. In fact, the new model army of Great Britain is a good example. In fact, during the time of the English Civil War, they were wearing a majority of plate armor at the early start of the conflict. By the later periods, they only started to wear only helmets. Preferably the Marion helmet, as some people pronounce it. I just call it the moron helmet, as it's also been known as called. Now, what does this mean also for continental Europe, especially when it comes to warfare? People would automatically say, but Templar, when it comes down to warfare, it would entirely be of medieval knights and all that. Not exactly. Because one, the medieval knight was on the downward spiral during the time of the late Renaissance. And in such, before the earlier colonial period, the last knight was actually stated to have been somewhere during the time of the English Civil War. And as well, when we also take a look at warfare, we also got to think of naval warfare and siege warfare. Siege warfare entirely would be a lot different. Instead of using the great bombards or cannons to destroy castle walls or city walls, we end up seeing trebuchets and catapults. And in such, these are very dangerous weapons. For example, the biggest type of trebuchet in history was used by none other than, well, Edward I of England, known as the War Wolf. He was actually stated to have launched it on Stirling Castle, and in such, it destroyed an entirety of one wall with one blow. So, yeah, even with the fact that warfare itself would end up changing, I doubt it would end up being any different. But the thing is, the majority of weapons, such as siege weapons or as well naval weapons, would either be ballistas, or catapults, or trebuchets. And as such, warfare would be the majority of castles and walled cities. However, what might ask would happen to the city of Constantinople? Would it still fall to the Ottoman Turks? Most likely. Pretty much because of the fact, even if there wasn't no cannons, I could probably see a big giant warwolf being used by the Ottomans. So in fact, the city of Constantinople would still fall in our timeline. And as well, this also means that colonization of the Americas would still happen. And such, well, nothing could end up changing from this, except for the fact continental Europe would end up using crossbows, and as well, the said British would end up using longbows. Now people would automatically ask, Templar, what does this mean? Why do I mean by this? Simple. The way in warfare would end up changing. And the fact is, colonization of the Americas would still go on the same way as it does in our timeline. Mainly for the fact that, one, pretty much Native Americans didn't have metal armor, so they're kind of screwed. And the fact is, warfare itself would still come out around the entire era, such as the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, every conflict, you name it. It's only by the 1800s that I would probably see an end to the said pike and volley formation of archers. Now, before anyone starts thinking that, Templar, there's nothing dangerous about getting shot with an arrow, here's the thing, that's where you're wrong. Getting shot with an arrow is very dangerous. I should know I have accidentally been shot once by accident before, and as such, these things are very dangerous. However, I actually got hit with a hunting bodkin when medieval Europe was using something like this. This is a wide assortment of archery arrows, such as from broadheads, bodkin heads, you name it. So, these were known to pretty much kill someone with little ease. And in a major form also, one major thing I have to put out here is, early firearms only had a range of around 175 yards, with effective round, pretty much around, say, 100 yards. And the fact is, volley fire was only pretty much between 25 to 50 yards. So in fact, even with the range of firepower from 175 to only being accurate around 100, and volley formations only being 25 to 50 yards away, here's the thing. The English longbow had a range system of at least 200 to 500 yards, and it could even fire 12 shots a minute, compared to 3 shots of a minute from the British redcoat. This meant one major thing. Warfare itself would be a lot further back and a lot more horrifying. But the fact is, warfare itself would be entirety of a different form. Pretty much until the early 19th century, or in this case, late 19th century. Pretty much around the time of the said conflicts, such as in the 1860s, mainly with steam power. Now, people would automatically ask, Templar, what do you mean by steam power? Simple. Steam-powered weaponry would end up being involved. Now, there were weapons like this in history, such as with the Confederate steam-powered cannon and as well as steam-powered machine gun. Instead of relying on, well, such as weapons like catapults or trebuchets and such, we're starting to evolve from that and deal with pressurized steam cannons. And the fact is, this would probably be the most horrifying thing you could probably ever think of hearing in the warfare. However, in the 1870s, there are the first CO2 firearms. Now, earlier firearms were not exactly, well, normal CO2 guns. The normal CO2 guns were like kind of like a canister system of filled in air, or like an air pump. Now, I could probably see this weapon actually coming around somehow in history. And as such, it became much kind of like, well, taking his weapons like this. Now this looks like a normal BB gun, am I correct? Well, here's the thing. We would actually take away these small little lead balls that are fired from this, and pretty much fire something like, well, I want to say somewhere in the size and shape of a said ice pick. That little metal piece on the end, that would actually be our round now. It wouldn't be the bullets that we fire in our modern day firearms. It would now be something with a CO2 powered or air powered pump system. With the pressure of the said system in, guess what? All they need to do is rack back a system, put the round in, close it, and fire. This means one major thing. Warfare changes in a very different form. Even if gunpowder is taken away, firearms would still emerge in a different type of form and manner. In fact, by World War I standards, conflict ends up changing. And the fact is, there is now a new weapon in play. And as such, this means that firearms, like this, but instead of firing regular bullets like this, they would probably fire something like this. A needle-like weapon fired from a narrow-like tube. In fact, let's take a look how dangerous this is. This isn't a BB gun, damn it. So in fact, this is dangerous enough. So the fact is, what happens to this major form? Simple. Air pressure. Air pressure is the major key player. And the fact is, we would probably already have a design system for a breech load system to put in the round, close it, and then it's ready to fire. This meant one major thing. By World War I standpoints, we probably even have guns that actually look near identical to the said Mauser broom handle, only instead of the Mauser broom handle having the magazine in the front, there are two magazine systems. What I mean by two magazine systems? Kind of obvious. One magazine for the rear, which would probably contain the CO2 cartridge. The second magazine would be in the front, which would be your regular mag. This means warfare itself would still emerge the same way it does, and now only a lot worse. And the fact is, conflict itself would imaginably evolve in such a worse manner and tone that I could still see somehow firearms like this emerging on the battlefield. So, even by World War II standpoints, the gun is still around. Cannons, machine guns, tanks, you name it, are now emerging into warfare. However, I don't know how this would affect aerial warfare, at least for a time. However, I could probably end up seeing something like massive bombs being dropped on cities. Instead of it being filled with gunpowder, it's filled with something even worse. Napalm. And the worst part about this is, warfare itself is worse and much more horrifying to the average eyes. And the fact is, conflict itself could still emerge this worse way than it does in our timeline. Meaning, I could see somehow firearms still emerging, and in such, conflict still emerges even to this day. In fact, pretty much there's more research and development into CO2 style weaponry, and as well, also something else. By the end of the Cold War, we would probably see more coil guns and CO2 firearms evolving from their type of form. This meaning that we probably would end up having guns and weapons and armor just like that from Halo. Which kind of sounds cool, but there's also a catch with this idiocy, and I had to put this out here real soon. And in such, we probably would end up having something near identical to a blaster, or something like that of a, electrical magnetic type of weapon. Seeing that, in fact, not all research is put into firearms, it's now put into newer futuristic style weapons. All because we did not actually do research on firearms themselves. So in fact, warfare itself would actually change. In fact, the gun would still come around, only it would take a couple of centuries. So in such, it would technically be, in our own timeline, the firearm actually first saw Europe in the 1400s. But when gunpowder was finally pushed into the modern form, or in this case, these CO2 or these coil gun weapons now being used, they're first started in the 1800s, at least 400 years after the modern era. And by at least 500 years after our own timeline, when guns are being used, we now have new futuristic weaponry. All because guns, powder never existed. This major form, this means that guns would still exist. And the worst part of it is, it's going to be a lot more horrifying. Why do I say more horrifying? Simple. This little needle that enters your body. People would automatically think Templar getting hit by this would not be that bad. You would think wrong. Because one, this little bastard can easily penetrate through bone. The fact is, this, with a high pressure volley system enough, it could enter through a heart and worse. And the worst case scenario is, I could still see horrifying weapons somehow emerging from this, even worse in our timeline. In fact, majorly to this form, cities themselves would entirely be, well, covered by walls. And such, major cities, for example, like New York, San Antonio, Houston, Washington, D.C., Detroit, Los Angeles, San Francisco, major cities, in fact, all in the United States. Those major cities would end up having walled cities because there are no cannons around until the 1800s. And the fact is, naval warfare would change as well, only for a short while to our modern standards. So in fact is, I don't know what warfare would look like, but I can guarantee you one thing. It would not be a pretty sight and picture. It would be a lot more horrifying, and as well, more people could probably end up dying from it. Especially when it comes to crime. Crime would be a lot worse, especially from around the timeline. Now, what do I mean by this? Simple. Modern day police have only started using firearms in the late 1800s. Like this. And the fact is, what happens if there are criminals in a small city? It's not going to stop somebody from using a knife, a sword, a machete. In fact, modern police also have to deal with this problem. And the fact is, they don't have guns now. At least not for a while. Now, people would automatically say, oh, but Templar, people were so kind back then. Oh, really? Let's take a look what happened with Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper didn't use a gun. He used a knife. And the worst problem is, this means that instead of school shootings, we mostly get school stabbings, school killings, massacres, which are a lot more horrifying. And the worst part of it is, there's also trauma that actually comes out of it. In fact, this major form I have to put out here is the following, that we actually, as human beings, actually are probably a lot safer that we now have firearms, rather than waiting for us to invent CO2 guns. But many people would automatically ask, Templar, are you a supporter of firearms? I am a supporter, and as well I do own firearms for major reasons, to defend and protect my family and everyone around me from said criminals who do have a firearm. So why is it that end up having no firearms would be a bad thing entirely? Well, simple. No firearms means no protection. And the fact is, early firearms like this, especially during the late 1900s, would entirely be somewhat off limits for a while, up until probably the modern 2000s. But then we would end up having to deal with still the same amount of conflict. Only now our armor and weaponry looks something like that out of Halo. So, yeah. Even if we got rid of gunpowder, I could still see with modern technology inventing newer and much more deadlier weapons. So, pretty much there is no change to our modern timeline, except for about 400 to 500 years. But, entirely though, human beings will always find a way to fight against each other. And the fact is, this means our modern standpoints on warfare would be slightly different for a while. But if y'all have any other ideas of how this could have ended up looking, please let me know in the comments below. I'll be happy to hear your thoughts. Anyways, guys, hopefully to hear from y'all in the next one. If y'all have any suggestions for another What If video, let me know in the comments below. I've been Co2 Templar, and as well, I'll hopefully see y'all in the next one. Have a great day, y'all.